All right. So hello, as Luigi said, I'm Max Burnette, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the search features in Clowder. This is something that's undergone some changes in the last few months, driven by a few different projects. There's some new things there, and there's some things that we've gotten enough questions about that we thought it would make sense to clarify. So in general, I want to talk about what kinds of things you can actually search in Clowder, and you can search via the GUI, which would be the web interface, or you can search via the API, which is primarily for programmers, but I wanted to mention it here just to show what that experience is like. And then at the end, I just have a couple more technical slides that I'll probably just brush over, but in the event that anyone finds them interesting, there are sort of some quirks about the search interface. So first of all, in terms of what is searchable, right now we provide search interfaces on the three most common types of resources in Clowder, which are files. Data sets are made up of files, and collections are made up of data sets, and there's some other nesting that you can do there. But you can generally search across these types of resources at once. And when you do a search, so when I say that, I mean that you use the search box, which is the most common way of searching. We'll see an example of that in a minute. We search a few different fields by default. This is going to include the name of these resources, any description that they've been provided. You can search for the creator who generated the resource, and anything that they're tagged with. There are other fields that you can search through, but you have to use a sort of specific syntax to search those things. If you just type a term in the box, you search across these fields. And so in the screenshot on the right, I have an example search where I've searched for the word kitty, and I have found a few different images here that are related to cats. Cat is not in the title, or kitty is not in the title of these images or the author, obviously, but they're tagged with the same tag, and that results in these things being returned, even though I did not specify that I'm searching for tags. So that's kind of the way the basic search works. It's going to return all the types of resources that are found based on whatever you search on. In terms of the other fields, so those are kind of the basic fields. There are other things that we support with this sort of field colon notation, which is similar to what you might have seen in Google search and some things like that. So we support specific filtering to the name or the creator of the resource. You can search for a specific type. So if you say resource type is data set, you will only get data sets in your search results, obviously. You can specify a tag. And then the two towards the end there, in and contains, are ones that we've had requests about. Basically, this lets you search for an object that's within a larger collection or a data set. So I want to find all the files that are named this within this collection or within this space. And so you basically get the ID of the resource that you want to act as the parent or the child, and you can go ahead and do that. You can also search metadata fields, and there's a specific user interface that makes this a little bit easier, but you can do this in the search box as well. So the example I have at the bottom, alternative title with a specific phrase. And if you use quotes, you can define those things as a single term. And generally the rule is that if the part on the left half of the colon, which is alternative title in this example, if that does not match one of these fields up in the slide, like name, creator, contains, if it's not one of those magic words, then it's assumed to be a metadata field, and we will search through the metadata for anything that matches that as well. So in general, it's a very powerful search capability, but there's a little bit of an art to it if you have a lot of things in your database that you want to search through. So here's an example of a slightly more involved search where I say the name is lion.jpg and the creator is this creator ID, which is actually myself. And you can see that this returned one specific result, which is this lion image that we've seen before. So you can append multiple queries to your term, and it's treated as an and. We also support regular expressions, which is something that you might not have come across before, but it's something that lets you search for essentially wildcards. It's something that you might have seen in this context. So I have a search on the left that says puppy, and I see a couple photographs show up that have a single dog in them. I can also do a search for puppies, and I can see photos that have multiple dogs in them. And these are tags that we've tagged in the database as puppy or puppies. But it might be that I want to find anything that includes either of these terms. So I can do a search with a wildcard, which is the dot asterisk at the end of my search term there, and PUPPY and PUPPIES are both returned in the search. And you can see kind of with the boxes that I've highlighted that we have a search result from the first box and a search result from the second box included in the third box. So if you have some ambiguity in the term that you're searching, you can use these wildcards to make sort of a fuzzy search and say, you know, I want anything that starts with these letters, ends with these letters, has this stuff in between. We use Elasticsearch search notation, and I'll mention this again in a moment, but there's actually a very powerful set of tools that you can choose from when you want to write these regular expressions. So if you're more of an advanced search user, there's a lot of power that you can harness with that. So if you're on the search page, this is what I was speaking about a moment ago. There is a help text that basically summarizes a lot of this and shows examples of what you can do. So if you're on the search page and you can see the search box there with kitty in it, there is a link on the right that says search syntax in this yellow box. And if you click that, it'll show this box below that basically has the list of fields that we just talked about, some examples of how they can be used in the middle column, and a little description of what you're actually searching in the right-hand column. So if you ever forget what you're searching or you're getting confused about why you're not seeing a result that you expect to find, you might want to look at the search syntax and see if you're using things properly. There's a link there in red right above the yellow box. This is Elasticsearch Regular Expression Syntax Help. That is an external link that shows you all the different regular expression tools that you can use, like that asterisk I showed a moment ago. So in general, right on the Clowder interface, we have this text that's meant to help provide that resource without needing to go look at some documentation elsewhere. So most of what I've been talking about up to this point deals with searching through the GUI, the graphical user interface, which is basically the Clowder web page. And the most common way of doing this is through the search box, which is in the upper right-hand corner of the search interface if you have the Elasticsearch enabled. And any of the terminology that we've just talked about in terms of tags and multiple search terms and regular expressions are valid if you enter them in that search box. When you hit search, it'll take you to a search page that shows the results, and that's where you can see some additional information about syntax if you're looking for more help. At the bottom, you can see I've already mentioned a couple of these things, but if you put spaces between terms, these are treated as and. Right now, there is no way to do an or search with the search box. We can do that with metadata, and I'll show that in a moment, but right now there's no way to specify or, although we are looking into that. You can use quotes to delineate phrases, so if you have something that has to have spaces in it, just put quotes around it, and it'll treat that as a phrase rather than as multiple individual terms. And on the search page that shows the results, right now it's capped at 60 results. And unfortunately, with the code that is deployed in many places today, it's not possible to request additional results yet. You're basically stuck with the 60 that you see initially, and if you don't see the result that you want to see, you might have to refine your search terms. But a feature that's currently in review will add an infinite scrolling capability like you might see on your phone, so that as long as you keep scrolling to the bottom of the page, if there are more search results to show, it'll automatically load those until you've exhausted all the search results. And another feature that we've seen asked about is a total results number. So now, again, in review, is the opportunity to see the total number of results that you've gotten from your search right at the top of the page before you start scrolling through them. So if you do a search and you see that there are 1,200 results, you might want to try to add some additional qualifiers to that before you start scrolling, unless you really want to look through 1,200 results. There's also a metadata search interface, which is a little bit more friendly to somebody who wants to sort of use a browser experience. And this is restricted to metadata, as the name implies. So you reach this interface by clicking on Explore at the toolbar at the top of the page, and metadata search is an item that's highlighted in red here on that list. If you go to the metadata search page, you will see an interface like is shown on the top of the page here. And this basically lets you build queries similar to what we've just seen in the search box, but you can do it with a set of drop-downs and buttons to basically provide a helper to help you build these complex queries. So in the screenshot, hopefully folks can kind of see what this is, but it's basically saying a search where an alternative title equals Steel's Caddis, and an aperture value is greater than 32 in the metadata for this resource that I'm searching. And I have it set to search for all of those terms. So you can basically provide these terms and see them explained in a way that is easy to add and remove terms to your search query without having to type these things into a box directly. So a couple things to notice here that make them a little bit different from the search box right now is that you can do an OR search. It's applied to everything on the list right now. So we don't support complex grouping of this and this or this and this, but we're talking about ways to accomplish that. Right now you can basically match all of the selected terms or any of the selected terms, which is the and the or. We allow different operators. So in the search box results where you say tag : kitty, that is an equal. Basically the tag has to be kitty or it will not be returned. But we support some additional operators on this page, which you can see on the right-hand side here, such as does not equal, contains, greater than, less than. We're looking at opportunities to expand this list, but for right now, there are some additional options to provide there in order to support kind of a more complex search. And potentially these things might make their way into the search box if we can find a user-friendly way to implement those. We can also provide autocomplete to help you navigate your metadata. And so as some of you may know, if you're using Clowder and you have many things that have been uploaded with many different extractors running, you'll end up with a lot of different types of metadata describing your files and your data sets. And so rather than providing a massive list that you have to scroll through to find the metadata field that you're interested in, when you start typing, we will try to autocomplete those for you. So in the screenshot at the bottom there, you can see that I've typed in P, and it is suggesting some sort of pre-configured metadata fields, such as primary publication and principal investigator, which are common across many Clowder instances. But there's also some extractor-specific metadata described as such. So at the bottom there, we have an extractor called NCSA CV profiles. It has a metadata field in its output called profiles, and if I were to select profiles at the bottom, it would only be searching for images that have NCSA CV profiles metadata. So it ends up being a very powerful feature because you can actually restrict only the resources that have this specific piece of metadata from the specific type of extractor or user, and then find things within that that are further filtered by the values that you provide. So it ends up being a very powerful search capability, and we're trying to find the right balance right now between what is capable, what is possible through the metadata search that you see here and what is identical via the search box, so that eventually we can sort of reach a synthesis of these things and potentially just provide a unified interface. But as it is right now, the more powerful metadata search has this nice search interface here. The other way that you can search is through our API. And again, this is sort of more of perhaps a programming-oriented type of resource, but I think it's worth mentioning. So first of all, what is it? An API is an application programming interface. It's basically a way that you can call URLs in Clowder and get data back in a programmatic way rather than in a web page. So data is returned in what's called a JSON format, and it's readable by code in addition to humans. So if you're writing a script that needs to download data from Clowder, you would call our API to get lists of data and then interpret that in whatever way that your script needs to. The nice thing here is that the syntax that's supported by our search API is identical to the search box, and the code that's under the hood that gets run when you do this search is identical. So you could do a search in the GUI, do a search via the API, and the results that you get will be identical. This is something that has recently undergone an update. So if you've used the API before and you search for a particular term, you'll see something like on the left, which generally returns you a list of IDs of files, data sets, or collections that match the query that you have requested. And again, this is capped at 60 items in the response. So if you saw this on the left, you would then essentially be responsible for taking that ID and making an additional call to the API to get that file information, or potentially going to its file page using that ID as the identifier. What we heard was that there was a need to basically expand the amount of information that's returned when you do these search requests. So currently in review is a revision of the search response that'll have a full object describing each search result. So on the right-hand side, you can see the ID as the first item in the object describing the thing, but that's no longer the only piece of information. You also have the name, you have the resource type, in this case it's a data set there at the bottom, you have the author, the spaces that it's within, the description, and so on. So it becomes something that's a little bit easier for scripts and for users to navigate, because you actually have all that information there initially rather than needing to do an additional step to get that information from Clowder. So this is something that's currently in review, but we expect it to be deployed in the near future. There's also this idea of pagination. So I alluded to this earlier with our infinite scrolling on the GUI, because we wanted to make it so the user didn't have to click through pages and worry about pages when they were navigating their search results. That's not possible via the API. The way the API works is that you make a call, you get a search result object, and that's that. You just have that in your browser and you can't scroll down to get more. Instead, what we've decided to do to make this a little bit easier for users is to return the information that you would need to get additional results. So if I've done an initial search and I've got 60 results and I don't see what I'm looking for, so I want to get the next 60, it would be nice for Clowder to return me the exact URL that I go to get the next 60 results in my result set. And that's what you see here. This is sort of a standard way of doing this across the web, where your results, which are actually collapsed in the screenshot, you can see them right in the middle of my box here with the ... those are collapsed to be hidden. You have some metadata about the search that you've performed. So in the URL that I've searched here, I've done a search for the term pub, which query equals pub, and size equals 4, means I only want 4 results at a time, and from equals 8, meaning I want to start at the 8th item. This is sort of a standard way of doing pagination, and you can, instead of using from, you can do things like page size is 4 and page equals 10, and you'll get the 10th page, assuming 4 items per page. So there's some power if you wanted to write your own user interface on top of your Clowder API or some other use case with your script to iterate through all the results without worrying about getting too large of a set of results at any one time. And what you see in the screenshot in these yellow boxes is a standard set of entries for first, last, next, and previous, referring to pages. And if you look closely at the terms that are in those URLs, you can say that if my page size is 4 and I've got results 8 through 12, then my next page would be 12 through 16, my previous page would be 4 through 8, and so on. So the idea is that you can use these URLs to quickly get the next and previous set of search results without really having to think about it very much. There's also some information about how many records were searched and all of that so that you can use that for different purposes, including the total number of results that you're going to get at the end of the day. The API is generally very powerful, and if you have things that need automated scraping of Clowder, automated reading of the records, the API is generally the recommended way to do that. These last two slides, again, are just things I'm going to talk about briefly in order for people to perhaps understand a little bit better what results they see and which they don't. The first is just a reminder about permissions. And, you know, it seems like an obvious thing to say, but across all these search methods, you're only going to see the results that you have permission to see, which means that you could potentially do the same search as your neighbor, and if they have a different account with different permissions, you will not see the same search results. This is distinct from something like Google, where everybody sees the same search results with an asterisk, obviously. Just as a general reminder, within Clowder, spaces that contain your data can be private or public, and that would control whether or not you as an individual can see the search results within those spaces. But even in public spaces that otherwise are accessible to the world, individual data sets can be made private as well. So it's possible that data sets in a public space will not be visible to you, or will be visible to you and not visible to your colleague. And so I want to just point this out as a reminder for potential confusion in the future. And I have a screenshot there. This is a data set called Choco Banana Foods, and you can see because I was the owner of this data set, you can see where I can change this to public or private. And again, you might see different numbers of search results depending on what your permissions are. The other thing I'll just mention briefly is databases. So Clowder as an application has the ability to turn on and off certain features depending on how much compute power you want to deploy with your Clowder application. And one of those things that's optional is Elasticsearch, which is generally a service that you can use to index data and do very fast queries on them. MongoDB is the primary database for Clowder, and it is required. So you always have to have a Mongo instance, and that's what actually stores all of our data. But if you optionally enable Elasticsearch, your data will also be indexed in Elasticsearch, and you can do some additional functionality on that data that you cannot do if you're only running Mongo. In practice, I believe the majority of Clowder instances are using Elasticsearch, so chances are that everything that you've seen in this part of the presentation is going to be accessible to you. But it's possible that if you have Elasticsearch disabled for one reason or another, there are certain features that will not be possible, such as the search box in the upper right-hand corner of the page. If you do your searching without Elasticsearch, you might see a different set of search results because we use Mongo to perform the search, and the search results may be slightly different. In addition, there are certain things that are faster or slower depending on what database you're using. So the takeaway message here is that if you are looking at this presentation, you're not seeing certain things in your instance of Clowder that you want to do in order to be able to search, you might want to talk with your server administrator about whether or not Elasticsearch is enabled and how to deploy that in order to do that. So I wasn't really thinking, and I put a question slide even though it's a webinar and there's not an opportunity for questions. So here's just a recap of what we've talked about, and there's some contact information there if there are any email questions that people wanted to ask.
We can take a quick question if anyone has a question. You can also type it in the chat if you would like.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, otherwise, that's the search portion.
Sorry, it took me a while to find my mute button. I did have one question. That was, you were showing the first query. There's a lot that are done by ID, and I was just curious if there was a reason for using the ID in a query rather than a string. So in one example, you had the creator ID, or why not just use Max?
Yes, this is something that we've gone back and forth about. Generally, there's no reason we could not support either or both. The creator ID essentially is something that was already presented in the Clowder data structure. So the amount of change that we were going to do to the Clowder source code was minimized by using the creator ID. If we wanted to include the name as the thing that is indexed in Elasticsearch, and there's enough interest in that, that is something we can certainly support. It's just going to require some additional change to the way that Clowder moves data around internally before it presents that data to the user. And so the idea here was, because enough things were changing with these recent features, that we didn't want to change things that were sort of deemed as unnecessary in the short term. We did not do that. But, you know, again, David, I think if that's something that you feel really improves the user experience, then by all means, we can create a ticket for that and look at making those changes. There's really, I mean, at some point, you know, we talk about how much do we want to make accessible in the search, because there's a lot of information that we store about these resources that were not mentioned in those slides, right? We have information about additional features in the resources that we don't expose to the search interface. And you could continue to index additional things, and there's kind of maybe a cost-benefit analysis to look at in terms of the performance and the size and speed of the indexing and all of that. But the short answer is that this was an easier way to implement things in order to get this feature deployed more quickly. But in the future, I think something like supporting the name or the name of the space rather than the ID are things that we could certainly look into. That's just not what's implemented right now.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I've just seen a number of workflows in which it's like, first you have to find the ID, and you know, you search by a string to find the ID, then you get the ID, and then you do something else. And when Scott Rohde was taking over BettyDB, one of his, general things was to get away from using IDs and moving toward things that are human readable, and saying like the IDs are really for the machine. So it's just
and I think that's a great point, that the API, maybe it's more of a common pattern to do this ID lookup type of pattern for a machine. But in the user interface, like the search box examples, it probably makes less sense to ask the user to go get that ID before they do the search. So I think that's a point well taken that we can certainly look at.